Antony Davies is Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University. His research interests include econometrics, public policy, and consumer behavior. He's authored over 150 op-eds for, among others, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Forbes, Investor Business Daily, and the New York Daily News. He's a frequent lecturer on conferences on Capitol Hill, and his YouTube videos on economics and statistics have gathered millions of views. So if you like what you see today, please do check out his YouTube videos. And I don't have this in the bio in front of me, but I should mention he's also the co-host, again, with James Harrigan, of the Words and Numbers podcast, which is a great podcast. And after The Curious Task, which is our podcast, Words and Numbers should probably be your second podcast stop each week. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. I'm going to pass the floor over to Antony now.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Antony Davies. I'm at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. I'm going to talk to you about why the world, or how it is that the world is becoming a better place, despite the fact that we tend to think it isn't. And this story begins with the media's love for viewers, or maybe I should be more specific. It's the media's love for the advertising dollars that viewers can bring in. And as with any business, the media is looking to get advertising dollars as a consequence of the customers, which you can think of as the viewers. And how does it do that? Like with any business, it has to deliver what its customers want. And what the viewers want is bad news. We just love stories of war and pestilence and violence. And how do I know we love this? Well, we could look at our behavior. Take CNN, for example, a major media network site that shows us all of this bad news that we talk about. It's the 33rd most popular site in the United States by web traffic. Now, there are other sites you can go to that will show you also legitimate news, but it's strictly the good news. For example, goodnewsnetwork.org. Now, goodnewsnetwork.org is the 10,194th most popular website in the United States. There's a website, ismycomputeron.com. And if you go to ismycomputeron.com, you see this. That's it. That's the website. Ismycomputeron.com is the 58,000th most popular website in the United States. So in terms of internet traffic, Good News Network is a lot more like Is My Computer On than it is like CNN, at least as far as our revealed preferences demonstrate. So we're kind of left in this very strange place where when it comes to the major media, we believe what they say, and rightly so. I'm not telling a story about fake news here. Some of the things media gets wrong, but generally speaking, the major media gets things right. And so we legitimately believe, and correctly so, we believe what they say. The problem is we go one step further and we don't believe what they don't say. And this creates a problem. And the problem is we start to see the world in a different way than it actually is, because we're only seeing half of it. We're only seeing the bad news. We aren't seeing the good news. And so let's talk about some of the bad news that we see. Of course, we hear all sorts of things about gun violence in this country. And if you listen to the major media, they'll tell you things. For example, in 1993, gun violence in the United States got worse compared to 1992. And those were the headlines throughout 1993 about how bad gun violence was in the United States. 1994, gun violence got worse again. And again, the media plasters all these stories about gun violence getting worse, and it was all correct. It was true. But then something interesting happens. Starting in 1995 through about 2002, gun violence in this country did not get worse. It got better. But because that was good news, and we have demonstrated by our behavior we don't want to see good news, the media didn't tell us that. It went on and told us other things that were bad news. And that's what occupied the media from 1995 through 2002 until 2003, when gun violence got worse. And again, the media says gun violence is getting worse. And this goes on and on for the years. Now, we believe what the media told us. We believe that the gun violence got worse, and that was okay. The problem is we didn't believe what they didn't say, and what they didn't tell us is when it got better. Pew Research Center has polled Americans every year going back for decades, asking them, do you think gun violence in the United States has gotten worse or better compared to the previous year? And from 1992 up until the present, every single year, except for 2 of them, Americans reported, yeah, gun violence has gotten worse in this country. Now, what did the media not tell us? What they didn't tell us is that over those years, gun violence only got worse in 1/3 of the years. In 2/3 of the years, the gun violence actually got better. It declined. But we didn't believe that. We didn't believe it because the media didn't tell us. And they didn't tell us not because they're lying, but because they're a profit-driven entity. They want to show us what will bring our attentions, the advertising dollars. And good news doesn't do that, but bad news does. Now, you might respond to this, okay, maybe we had all of those years when gun violence got better, but maybe the gun violence only got a little bit better. And in the bad years, it got remarkably worse. That's a legitimate counterargument. And we can look at that by asking what has been the firearm homicide rate in the United States going back to the 1990s. And what you see is it has declined on average 2% per year. Now, the bulk of those declines occurred from 1993 up through about 2000. And then thereafter, the gun violence rate kind of stayed pretty constant. But nonetheless, on an average basis, that's an average of 2% decline. Or if you don't like to look at the pre-2000s, we can say it's at least stayed pretty much constant. Now, you might say in response to this, okay, but you're showing me firearm homicide rates. There are lots of crimes that are committed with guns in which no one dies, and those crimes would not be showing up in this data. That's correct. We can look at that. That's called the non-fatal firearm crime rate. And that's declined an average of 4% per year since the 1990s. So no matter how you look at the data here, the truth that the media won't tell us, again, not because they're lying, but because it's not interesting. The truth is that firearm crimes in this country have at the worst been constant, and actually, depending on how you look at it, gotten substantially better. Related to this, of course, is the poster child of gun crime, which is mass shootings. And the media will show us this, and every time there's a mass shooting, we'll spend weeks of the talking heads discussing how it happened, what we could do to prevent it, and politicians suggesting all sorts of new legislation. And if you look at the number of Americans killed in mass shootings, you see this data, and this is the data that the media will show us. It's absolutely correct. And you can see it is somewhat alarming. There's an increasing trend over time, more and more Americans being killed in mass shootings. Absolutely correct. It's bad news. This is the sort of thing that media likes to show us. But what is the media not showing us? What the media is not showing us here is a bit of perspective. Now, again, here's the number of Americans killed each year in mass shootings. I'm going to superimpose on top of this graph the number of Americans killed in knifings. And what you see is that, yes, it's correct, the number of Americans killed in mass shootings has been rising over time, but it is a small fraction of the number of Americans who are killed in knifings. In fact, on average, on a year-by-year basis, 15 times the number of Americans are killed in knifings as are killed in mass shootings. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about mass shootings. Of course we should be concerned about it. But it is to point out the possibility that we're going to have misdirected public policy. Because if we're not 15 times as concerned about knifings as we are about mass shootings, then we're going to direct our resources toward the problem that is louder, that's getting more press, rather than the problem that's killing more people. We saw this same phenomenon with COVID. At the height of COVID, on an annualized basis, over 350,000 Americans were dying on an annualized basis from COVID. And this is what the media showed us. What the media didn't tell us was some context. And the context here is how many Americans die of things other than COVID on an annualized basis. And there, if you look at the numbers, you see that 2 to 3 times as many Americans die on an annual basis from cancer and heart disease as died from COVID. Now, the media doesn't underline this context, not because it's hiding anything, but rather because this context isn't scary. COVID was scary. Heart disease, cancer, not so much. We live with that on an ongoing basis. And so because it's not scary, it's not going to attract eyeballs. And if it's not going to attract eyeballs, the media is not going to get advertising dollars by reporting it. COVID was scary. That collected eyeballs, which generated advertising revenue. Now, as you look at this data, an argument may occur to you, and that is, you really can't compare heart disease and cancer to COVID because COVID's an infectious disease. It gets transmitted across people. Heart disease and cancer aren't infectious. That's correct, but that argument actually cuts in the other direction. Because COVID is infectious, it can be transmitted, we will, over time, naturally develop an immunity to it. If we did nothing to prevent COVID deaths, no inoculations, no social distancing, no masks, we did nothing, the number of COVID deaths would be higher than what you see there, but over time, it would tail off as we developed a natural immunity. Heart disease and cancer are not communicable, so we can't develop a natural immunity to these things. If we did nothing about heart disease and cancer, those numbers would remain just as high as they are into the indefinite future. So again, the argument here is not that we should not have been concerned about COVID. It's not that we should not have done anything about COVID. Rather, it's the question, if indeed heart disease and cancer are 2 to 3 times as deadly as COVID, why weren't we devoting 2 to 3 times as much energy, effort, resources to combating those as we committed to combating COVID? You can see this in the media pursuing your attention. If you look at the headlines, from March to May of 2020, when COVID was first a thing and we were all afraid about it, the media was reporting COVID deaths. And round about May of 2020, COVID deaths started to peak and they started to decline. So they ceased to be the scary bad news that they were before because the deaths are now declining over time. And if you go back and look at headlines, what you will see is that the media shifted. Starting around June of 2020, the headlines stopped being about COVID deaths. The media started to talk about COVID infections because although COVID deaths were going down, COVID infections were going up. And that's scary. So that's the thing that the media started to advertise. And then starting around October of 2020, COVID infections turned around. They started going down as well. So now the media's got this problem of COVID deaths are no longer as scary. They're not going to attract your attention. COVID infections are no longer scary. They're not going to attract your attention. What will attract your attention? Numbers that go up. What numbers are going up? COVID cases. In fact, COVID cases, they're guaranteed to only go up because a COVID case is anyone who has ever had COVID, even if they've recovered from it. So by definition, that number can only go up or at the worst stay constant. So this is what the media started talking about from October 2020 through March of 2021. And then COVID cases stopped being scary to us. And if you watch, you'll see that the media shifted. They started talking about deaths with COVID. And this didn't last long, only lasted about a month, where the headlines were deaths with COVID. And the reason it only lasted about a month is because viewers quickly figured out that deaths with COVID meant people who had died, yes, from COVID, but also people who died from, for example, car accidents and happened to test positive for COVID. So anybody who died, whether it was from COVID or not from COVID, but you had COVID at the time, you went into these numbers. So Americans, people at first were concerned about this, and then they became less concerned. And then monkeypox came out in July of 2021, and that was all over the media. But very quickly, people said, look, we've had enough of all of this business with COVID and the social distancing, all that. We don't want to hear about it. And because we didn't want to hear about it, it didn't attract our attention. And very quickly, the media shifted and started talking about other things. But what you can see as you track this through is the media looking for new ways to show us things that we find scary because it attracts our attention. The media will tell us that wages are stagnating, and if you look at the data over time, and this is, I don't have numbers for Canada, but I would imagine Canadian numbers follow relatively closely American numbers, at least in direction. This is real median annual wages. It's adjusted for inflation. And you can see from 1979 up through 2021, 2022, median real wages are up 8%. That is, our purchasing power has increased by 8%. Wages have risen 8% more than inflation. So strictly speaking, it's not correct to say that wages have stagnated. They've gone up 8% more than inflation. But on the other hand, that's since 1979. An 8% increase above inflation over the course of whatever we're talking there, 40, 50 years, that's not a lot to write home about. So maybe at least in spirit, this idea that wages have stagnated is correct. Okay, but there's something the media hasn't told us. And what the media hasn't told us is that workers aren't paid wages. They're paid compensation, which is the combination of wages and employer-paid benefits. So when your employer makes contributions to your health insurance or to your retirement fund or paid time off, whatever it is, all of these contributions that the employer pays on your behalf is part of your compensation package. And if you look at compensation from 1979 up to the present, you see that it has grown almost 60% more than inflation. That is, in terms of actual purchasing power, people's compensations are 60% more today than they were back in the late 1970s. You don't hear the story on the right, you hear the story on the left. Why? Not because the media is lying, but because we have demonstrated by our behavior that we like to see bad news. We like to see scary things. And the thing on the left is somewhat concerning. The thing on the right is not. So the media, being a profit-oriented entity, is going to show us the thing on the left, not the thing on the right. Along these lines, you hear about the disappearing middle class, and the media will show us this, and these numbers that you're seeing here are absolutely correct. In 1970, more than half of the households in the United States were middle class. Today, substantially less than half of households are middle class. This is what the media will point to. Now, I'm going to show you the actual data here on US households. And again, I'm not saying the media is lying. They are telling the truth. But you have to dig into the data to see what the media hasn't told you. Now, here's a bunch of incomes, and they're all adjusted for inflation. I'm going to divide these into the three categories that Census Bureau gives us: the poor, the middle class, and the rich. And I'm going to show you a bunch of bars. The height of the bar shows you the fraction of households that are in that income category. For example, here's the United States in 1970. In 1970, 16% of households earned what today we would call $35,000 to $50,000. In 1970, 24% of households earned what today we would call $50,000 to $75,000, and 14% earned what today we would call $75,000 to $100,000. So that's 53% of US households in the middle class in 1970. And similarly, in 1970, 33% of households were in the poor classes and 14% were in the rich classes. Now that's the United States in 1970. Now I'm going to move time forward. And as I move time forward, watch the pattern that emerges in these bars. Now here's 2020. What do you see? What you see is this trend from 1970 to 2020. The fraction of households in the middle class fell from 53% to 40%. That's what the media shows us. That's the scary news. The middle class is disappearing. Absolutely correct, it is. But there's more to the story that the media hasn't told us, and you see it when you look more closely at those bars. Look at the poor classes. From 1970 to 2020, they've also declined. In 1970, 33% of us were poor. In 2020, only 26% of us were poor. The middle class is shrinking, but so too are the poor classes. What's growing are the rich classes. In 1970, 14% of us were rich. Today, 34% of us are rich. That's excellent news, but that's not scary. And because it's not scary, it doesn't attract eyeballs. And because it doesn't attract eyeballs, the media can't make money from selling advertising. And so the media isn't going to tell us this. It's only going to tell us that the middle class is shrinking. That's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. And you'll hear this periodically, anecdotally. People will say things like, well, life was much better when in my grandparents' time. It's harder today. And while the media will happily interview people who are complaining about the quality of their life today and how things were better in the 1950s and 60s and whatever, there's some serious truth that the media isn't telling us. And you don't see this unless you dig into what life was like for a middle-class worker 100 years ago versus a middle-class worker today. So let's look at take-home pay. The middle-class worker 100 years ago, the average middle-class worker earned 20 cents an hour. The average middle-class worker today earns $18.64 an hour. And the average minimum wage worker in the United States, let's talk about the federal minimum wage, that's $7.25 an hour. Deduct taxes, and this person's earning $6.14. So here's our three people, the middle-class worker 100 years ago, the middle-class worker today, and a $7.25 an hour worker today. Now, you could look at these numbers and say, yeah, well, clearly what's going on here is you've had inflation. So yeah, the worker 100 years ago only earned 20 cents an hour, but things were cheaper 100 years ago. That's absolutely right. And the way to think about this is to ask yourself not how much are these three workers earning, but rather, given the prices they have to pay for things, and given how much they're earning, how long do these workers have to work to be able to earn enough money to afford various things they want to buy? Let's talk about the middle-class worker of 100 years ago. The middle-class worker of 100 years ago, given what he earned and given the prices at the time, he had to work 6 minutes to earn enough money to afford a stamp to mail an envelope. He had to work 20 minutes to earn enough money to afford a loaf of bread, 35 to 45 minutes to earn enough money to afford a movie ticket or a gallon of gas. And what about other things? Pound of coffee, dozen eggs, pound of butter, gallon of milk, all those things? He'd have to work an hour and a half to almost 2 hours to earn enough money to be able to afford those things. That's the middle-class worker of 100 years ago. Middle-class worker of today, that stamp only takes him 2 minutes of work before he's earned enough money to buy a stamp. The loaf of bread, the gallon of gas that took our middle-class worker 100 years ago 20 to 45 minutes to earn, today, our middle-class worker only has to work for 5 or 7 minutes to earn enough money to pay for those things. The pound of coffee, the dozen eggs, the pound of butter, the gallon of milk that took our middle-class worker a century ago an hour and a half to 2 hours to earn enough money to buy, today's middle-class worker earns enough to buy those things in 15 minutes or less. The only thing that's more expensive is the movie ticket. Today's middle-class worker has to work longer to afford a movie ticket than the middle-class worker 100 years ago. But look at what you get when you go to the movies today. Today's middle-class worker, when he goes to the movies, he gets this CGI effects and the surround sound and the comfortable movie chairs with the cup holders and all of this. What did the middle-class worker get when he went to the movies 100 years ago? He got silent films. There was no color. There was no sound. The chairs were wooden and uncomfortable. There was no air conditioning in the movie theater. So although the movie ticket costs today's middle-class worker more than it cost the middle-class worker of 100 years ago, the quality of the product is substantially better. Now, for comparison, let's look at the the minimum wage worker, and you can see across the board, with the exception of the movie ticket, across the board, the $7.25 an hour worker today can afford all of this stuff more readily than the middle class worker could a century ago. That is, in terms of these products, the $7.25 an hour worker today has a higher standard of living than a middle class worker of a century ago. Now, you might say in response, okay, but these are all consumable goods. What about expensive stuff like cars and houses? Let's look at a car. A century ago, the middle-class worker, it took 4 full years of his wages to store up enough money to buy a car. Today's middle-class worker, it only takes 10 months of his wages to store up enough money to buy a car. The $7.25 an hour worker, it only takes that person 2.5 years of labor. Today's $7.25 an hour worker can afford almost 2 cars for the same amount of labor that it took the middle-class worker a century ago to afford. And the story doesn't end there, because what do you get when you buy a car today, right? You get something like this: anti-lock brakes, skid control, DVD player, GPS navigation, collision warning, rear view camera, cruise control, airbags, 3-point seatbelts, electric windows, Bluetooth stereo, power steering, power brakes, power seats, heated seats, climate control, 12-volt outlets, roadside assistance, remote keys, automatic transmission, fatigue detection, and automatic high beams. What did the middle-class worker get when he bought a car a century ago? No horse. That was it. The car that the $7.25 an hour worker buys today is a spaceship compared to the car that the middle-class worker of a century ago could afford. And today's $7.25 an hour worker can afford almost 2 of those for the same amount of labor that it took the middle-class worker to buy his car a century ago. Same kind of story with housing, although our $7.25 an hour worker has to work a lot more to buy a house today than the middle-class worker of 100 years ago. But the same kind of story emerges when you get housing today. You get something like this, right? Housing a century ago, no electricity. Forget about hot water. There was no running water at all. Of course, no indoor toilet. You've got the outhouse in the backyard. There's no HVAC. You light a fire in this stove, and that's what heats the house. Actually, it probably doesn't heat the whole house. It heats the room in which the stove happens to be located. Our $7.25 an hour worker can't buy a house like a middle-class worker had a century ago. Not because the $7.25 an hour worker can't afford it, but because it's illegal. That standard of living is now, that was middle-class living a century ago, is now literally illegal. If this trend continues that I just showed you, that today's poverty line, what we literally call poverty, is actually a higher standard of living than the standard of living of the middle class a century ago. If that pattern continues for another century, I kid you not, come 2123, this that you see will be poverty in the United States and in Canada in a century. And it's kind of laughable to look at this and to think a century from now, someone living in the suburbs with a car in the garage and sending the kid to private school and a nice lawn and all of this, that we would call that poverty. That's laughable that we would call that poverty. But it is just as laughable to someone of 100 years ago to look at what today we call poverty. Now, I'm not suggesting here that we should treat poverty lightly, that we shouldn't be concerned about it. I am saying that we do need to put it in perspective. Sure, we have poverty, and absolutely it's something we should pay attention to. And yes, the line has moved, and what we call poverty today is a higher standard of living, but nonetheless it's poverty. Okay, fine. What we cannot do, however, is say that somehow people had it better 3-4 generations ago. That's obviously not the case. What else is the media not telling us? It's not telling us that deaths due to war over the past couple of generations are down 95%. It's not telling us that extreme poverty worldwide is down 80%, that child labor rates are down 50%, that gender inequality across the planet is down 15%, that income inequality is actually down by 10%, that longevity and education are up by 20%, that real per capita income, that's income adjusted for inflation, is up 40%. The media is not going to tell us this, not because the media is lying, but because the media is out to make a buck. And how do they make a buck? By telling us bad news. And this is not bad news. This is very good news. And what we're left with is the world that we have come to believe we live in is actually unreal. Not because any of the stuff we believe is false, but because the stuff that we believe we erroneously think is the entirety of the truth. We're missing the whole other part of the truth, and that's the good news. And why does any of this matter? It comes back to the question of policy. If we want good public policy, if we want to do things like fight climate change and fight COVID and fight gun violence, we absolutely must correctly identify what we have done wrong and stop doing it. But we just as readily must identify what we're doing right so that we can keep doing it. And when we have this lopsided view of the world, that we only see the bad, we never see the good, all of a sudden we focus all of our attention on new things we should be doing or things we should be doing differently, completely ignoring the things that we're doing well that we should keep doing. If you have enjoyed this, I have a weekly podcast, Words and Numbers. I and my colleague, who's a political scientist, we look at the world around us and talk to you about the world as we see it through the eyes of economics and political science. And also this book that Matt Buffton is giving away, Cooperation and Coercion, in which we talk about many of the things that I've discussed here. We have a little bit of time for questions.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Anthony. That was great. Reminder, we have a couple ways you can ask questions. If you'd like to use the reaction button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, you can use the hand raise and ask a question yourself. And if you prefer, you can type a question into the chat. Antony, I'm going to kick us off because there's a few people commenting about a couple of things while you were speaking. One is that it seemed like you were using mean averages when you were speaking about average wages and average incomes. There were some questions. Would that change? And if so, do you know how, if they were to use median statistics?
Yeah, no, actually, I was showing you median. So when I showed you wages versus compensation, that was the wages were median, the compensation may have been average, but that's simply because of what's reported, although I thought both were median. The bars that were changing over time, I showed you poor, middle class, and rich, that was all median. Those were not averages.
Right, thanks. And then another question, and we were speaking just before we opened up the meeting about our friend Steve Horwitz, who gave a similar version of this talk about the economic data and why we should be optimistic. And I know he used to have some of these charts on his website, but I can't find them there. Maybe you know. Is there a place people could look at data over a longer period of time, say 1950, 1970, 2000, 2020, to see the change over time in these cost of living measures?
Yes, unfortunately, there's no one place you can go for the data. For economic data, I advise going to FRED, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Database. And you can find data on United States, Canada, basically any country of the world there. And the easiest way to find it is go to Google and type what you want, per capita income, space, FRED. and it'll take you right there. The data is all set up very nicely. If you want data on crimes, there's the Bureau of Justice Statistics. You have to dig around a little bit more to find what you're looking for there. And I'd like to also point out there's a beautiful data set that comes from the Fraser Institute in Canada that measures economic freedom. So if you want some information on how countries have evolved over time toward or away from economic freedom, I highly recommend that data set. It's called
Wonderful.
Economic Freedom of the World.
Great. I'll try and post a link to that while you're answering these more questions. And I will suggest one other less scientific, but I would say more fun exercise. A few years ago, I got interested in this and was able to find on eBay for like $10 a 1975 Sears catalog. You may be able to find those out there. If you order a Sears catalog and then just look up what the either median wage or minimum wage was from that time, and then look through and do sort of rough calculations in your head, but how many hours you would need to buy that TV or that barbecue, that leisure jumpsuit is always a really fun one. So that's a bit of a lighter, entertaining way to do that. I'm going to turn now to some of the people who have raised their hands, and we're going to begin with Victoria Sampson.
Good afternoon, Antony. So just going back to the beginning of your talk here, I have a little bit more of a qualitative question as opposed to a statistical question. So as you were saying, the media is profiting off all of this bad news. So it sounds like just the nature of our economy and their profit motivations. This isn't going to be something that's going to cease in the near future. So my question for you is, how are we to distinguish between what is being used, as I know I use this word quite a bit at the beginning of COVID, just to ease the tension a little bit. So how are we going to distinguish between fear mongering on the news or these scare tactics that they're using with this data, and what we actually should and need to know in order to attribute adequate concern and potentially act on it as citizens?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And your question raises something that I want to underline here. We should not blame the media here. They're not the problem. The problem is actually us. We want to see the bad news. The media is just a business like any business. It's going to deliver what customers want. The problem's not them, the problem's us. This is what we're looking for. Now, what do you do faced with everybody else wants bad news? That's what the media is delivering. How do I find the rest of the story? You can do things like, there are good news sites like goodnewsnetwork.org. You have to troll around to look in there to find what's going on. But my advice to people is go and poke around in data yourself. And so I mentioned a couple places, Bureau of Justice Statistics and Fred, where you can find data. Anytime you see some bad news on the media, understand that there's more to the story and dig around yourself and look. And it's not a satisfactory answer, I know. What you want is to be able to go to one place that says, no, here's the rest of the story. Unfortunately, that kind of doesn't exist, right? You'll encounter individual people, Steve Horwitz, myself, who will show on an ad hoc basis the rest of the story. But largely, this falls on you. You've got to go and work this out, and use a good deal of skepticism as well. Next time you hear some bad news on the media, understand that it's biased. I'll give you a good example right now. We had the Silicon Valley Bank fail in California. And of course, the news media is saying this is the beginning of the meltdown of the entire financial system. Okay, at that point, I take a deep breath and say, what do we know? We know one fact: Silicon Valley Bank melted down. How many other banks have gone bankrupt? And we can look that up. And the media will tell you, whatever the number is, 6 banks went bankrupt this year in the United States. Okay, hang on. How does that compare historically? And if what you find is that historically, on a regular year-to-year basis, 10 banks go bankrupt, okay, well, 6 banks is nothing to worry about. But that kind of digging you have to do on your own, unfortunately.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to stand in our video queue and ask Al to ask his question.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks. That was great. You suggest that it's the profit motive of media that is driving this, and I don't have an argument with that, but I wonder what you think about it. I think there's another aspect. If you read the newspaper, which is what I do, one sees an awful lot of stories in which the only thing that happens is that the story is what people known as activists and advocates have to say about whatever. And so you get an entire story of written in the newspaper, say, of activist X says this, advocate L says that, and it's all very distressing. It's not really about data, it's about stirring the pot.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've come to lose the distinction between news and opinion, and too often now what's peddled as news is really a lot of opinion. I'm not saying I like it, I don't, but I will say this isn't new. You go back to the years of yellow journalism, 150 years ago, and this is something that's been with us for a long time. I think if anything, the reverse happened through the maybe 50s, 60s, 70s. We got a period in which the journalism news organizations actually focused on telling us the facts rather than telling us what to think. But I think that ended up being the aberration. What we're going through now is a normal thing. And I would say, if you're looking for an antidote, the best antidote that I have found, and it's not perfect by any means, is to just admit, okay, you're going to give me your slant on the thing, so I'm going to look for slants from opposite ends. Understanding the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle. So I will regularly read, on the one hand, the Wall Street Journal, and also on the other, the New York Times, understanding that both of them are going to give me, and understanding then the truth is somewhere in the center. And it's kind of left up to me to figure out what the confines of that truth might be.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Going to go back to the chat now. Benjamin has a question. Sort of a different factor. You talked a lot about sort of certain violence measures, health measures, income measures, but Benjamin is interested in war. Says, if we accept the economic premise that things are getting better, how do we square that with another European conflict raging? And I presume he means the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with the potential for the conflict to expand and then bring in NATO countries.
Yeah, so remember, what I've been showing you throughout here are trends. And in any given year, we can back off from the trend, and then the years further we go back in the other direction. So the general trend has been that we're becoming more peaceful. And we can point to Ukraine and what's going on there and say, well, there's an example that we're not becoming more peaceful. Look at everything that's happening there. To which I would reply, yeah, in an absolute sense, things are less peaceful this year than they were 3 years ago. But consider, suppose everything that just happened with Russia invading Ukraine, all of that, suppose all of that had happened just as it did, not in 2020, 2023, but rather in 1930, 1940. We would have had a very different outcome. We would be embroiled in a multi-country war right now, much more so than is going on now. So in that sense, if you compare it to what has happened in the past, what's happening, as unfortunate as it is in Ukraine, is remarkably, how should I say, it's remarkably less violent than what it would have been, that same situation would have been at any other point in human history. And that, to me, is good news. Does that mean that we should not worry about what's coming next year? Yeah, I think we should, and we should be vigilant about that sort of thing. But it is to say that the general trend is toward a much more peaceful world.
Great, thank you. Going to come to William, who's been waiting patiently with his hand up.
Hello, Anthony, and hi, my name is William. I'm coming from California, so thanks for mentioning the bank. I have a couple things to put to you, and I'm going to take them in this order. I'll first mention that I broadly agree with the thesis that in some key ways things are getting better, so I'm not necessarily challenging that. I'm going to assume, based on not being overly familiar with your work, that your thesis as to why things are getting better at a systemic or economic perspective would be something along the lines of classical liberal economics is roughly working. and that capitalism, broadly speaking, allocates resources in such ways as makes things more efficient in terms of meeting people's needs and ends. I'll let you let that stand or challenge it if you want to. The questions I will ask are twofold. The first is, in deciding to put forward this thesis, why did you choose the specific metrics that you did, things like the income figures that we saw, the middle class elements and so forth? Was it just because these are statistics that the mass media generally purport upon, or was it something more deeply entrenched in your broader economic theory? And can you elaborate on that? The second question I will put to you is actually from Elizabeth in the chat, just in case we don't get to it. Why do we have so many people who are unhoused at the moment, if indeed these metrics you point out are getting better? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So why I picked the ones I did, I looked for just a broad variety of things that are commonly said in the media. There are some things that are said in the media that don't get a lot of attention, so they wouldn't have struck you. It would have been news that I was telling you this in the first place. So I wanted stuff that I was pretty sure my audience would have been familiar with already, and a broad variety of things. So it wasn't just economic, it was also social, it also dealt with crime, these sorts of things. So that's what led me to the collection of things I have here. That combined with, I've got 35 minutes, so I can only put so many things in here. The homelessness question is an interesting one. And there we have many moving parts. And perhaps the biggest moving part is the conditions, the economic conditions in which we're seeing the homelessness. And largely, not always, but largely the economic conditions in which we're seeing the worst homelessness are economic conditions in which the state or the local government has imposed rules intended to help alleviate homelessness that have actually backfired and caused an increase in homelessness. I give you an example right off is rent control. And this is something that we see repeatedly across time, across different states, across different cities. When a local government imposes rent control, what usually follows, not always, but what usually follows is a shortage of housing. And that is counterintuitive because I'm making housing cheaper. How can that be a bad thing? Because it is a good thing. You're making it cheaper, but it's only a good thing for people who already have housing. It's a bad thing for people who don't, because in forcing it to be cheaper, you have removed the profit incentive to build new houses. And so you get this chronic housing shortage. So I think in a lot of ways, what you're seeing, not in all the ways, but in a lot of ways, what you're seeing is a problem that's caused by government action that's directed with good intention in the wrong direction. In terms of, and that I guess relates back to your first point of my general stance here. My general stance here is one of economic freedom. And you can see this, you see a pattern emerge repeatedly. You see it across cities, you see it across states, you see it across countries, you see it across time. You see it when you look at rich societies, you see it when you look at poor societies. The same pattern emerges. And that pattern is the societies that have more economic freedom tend to score better on virtually every metric you would point to and say there's a metric that's indicative of a healthy society, whether it be less inequality, whether it be higher incomes, whether it be less poverty, less child labor, better environmental incomes, whatever it is. All of these things correlate very closely with economic freedom. Now, I want to be very careful here, because when I say those words, economic freedom, a lot of people hear less government. That's not economic freedom. Economic freedom is not less government. In fact, in some cases, it's more government. Economic freedom is using government to do the things government does well, and that is defining, enforcing property rights, and using markets to do the things that markets do well, and that is moving resources, allocating for production and consumption, this sort of thing. Societies that score higher in economic freedom get that mix right. They use government for the problems it was designed for, and they use markets for the problems it was designed for. And there you get the best, you tend to get the best outcomes.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on another question in the chat. While we were giving a presentation, you point to movie tickets as an example of an outlier, something that had got more expensive, and then talked about the qualitative differences between a movie from 2022 and a movie from 1922. On housing, I think there are reasons you would probably point to as why it's gotten more expensive. And although houses are better, I don't think that's just the story. You want to say a little bit about why housing is this great exception to people needing to work fewer hours to afford better things?
Yeah, well, housing, yeah. So when you say an exception, it's become more expensive. What I've been showing you, apart from the few examples I showed you of the gallon of gas and the pound of butter and all of that and the housing, you'll see examples like that, but you'll also see broad things like our purchasing power in general. And what you find is, in a broad sense, our purchasing power is way higher today than it was generations back. But there are exceptions, individual exceptions, and you'll see them. They tend to follow a pattern. A couple of the big exceptions are medical care, to an extent housing, education, higher education. You'll see these exceptions, and you tend to see them being more pronounced exceptions in instances in which we have more and more regulation of this thing. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying regulation is bad. There's regulations that are quite good. I don't want corporations dumping pollutants into the river. I don't want them defrauding their customers. There are regulations that help prevent that sort of thing. That's very good. I'm talking about regulations that go beyond that, that go beyond defining and enforcing property rights and go into the realm of trying to direct the market to do things the market wouldn't do otherwise. And there you see this proliferation. I can tell you from higher education, I'm a professor. Over the past 30 years, the number of professors per student in higher education has remained relatively constant. You have about the same number of professors per student today as you had 30, 40, 50 years ago. What has skyrocketed is the number of administrators, the number of people who are employed in higher education who don't teach. That has grown exponentially over the past few decades. And if you look at medical data, it's the same phenomenon. If you look at number of doctors and nurses per patient, it's about the same today as it was 2-3 generations ago. But if you look at people employed in the medical field who don't care for patients, administrators, that's skyrocketed, just like higher education. Why? Because in both instances, those institutions have had to hire all sorts of administrative infrastructure to make sure that their institution is adhering to guidelines, regulatory guidelines the government has imposed. And again, it's not to say that all regulation is bad, but it is to say that there's this effect that it's very easy for Congress to say, well, hospitals should do the following things, or higher education should do the following things. It takes Congress a few minutes to think that up and then some months to get it passed into law, and they go about and do something else. What they don't realize is that to adhere to those new rules requires the hiring of a whole number of people within the institution, creating whole new divisions to make sure that we're complicit with whatever this regulation is. And that comes back to the rest of us in the form of higher tuition and higher medical costs. Are there other factors at play? Yes, there are. But this is a big factor that I don't think we appreciate well enough.
Right, thanks. I should probably note there that my impression of the US is that the increase in housing has been more uneven than it is in Canada, where very many of the big cities have seen this fantastic spike in home prices, and in many cases, just over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm going to turn to Ivan now, who's waiting with his hand up.
Thank you very much. Real quick, two, I guess, quick anecdotes. One, I live in Seattle, and it's interesting that the city passed something like, to build a second house in Seattle, you need to pay just an extra $70,000 up front before you do anything involving getting land work done and whatever. So that feels like it's increasing, exponentially the problem with our housing, that you can't build new houses. Rich people are the only ones who can afford to build new houses, and they're like preventing them to do so. Yada yada, which is something I just wanted to add, is like something very specific. The other one is that I actually worked at Silicon Valley Bank for 4 years, which is it's very interesting to see their downfall, because they seemed like a success story not too long ago, which is kind of crazy. But my question for everyone, I was wondering, with the data, do you think there's a possibility that there are trade-offs that you can't see within the data that may be pernicious? So what I'm thinking about is the unrealized compensation from, I think it was excellent to see that, businesses nowadays are giving so much more in compensation of, health insurance and all those different 401k bonuses, all that kind of stuff. But that there is an uneven distribution for the use of that compensation by age. So, for example, when you're younger, you're not using Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all the health insurance that you're paying for, and yet you have a higher cost of education right now, and we're seeing that in the form of, people are taking longer to get married, to have children, to buy real assets. So I'm wondering, what do you think is a way that we can maybe include that in the data, or figure out a way to talk about those things that may be like hidden underneath what all looks good on the surface?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And the way to approach that is to disaggregate the thing. And so you could talk about not wages in general. I was showing you the median wage, not the median wage, but rather show me the median wage for 18 to 24-year-olds, or for 60 to 65-year-olds, or for blacks, or for people who are in the rural areas versus the cities. There are all kinds of ways you can break this out, and you'll see, some people gaining, some people losing, depending on what it is you're talking about. One interesting case here is as we extend Social Security in this country, if you break out the effects by race, you find that particularly African Americans are significantly worse off by extending Social Security than are whites, for example. And the difference lies in differences in life expectancy. The average white person has a longer life expectancy, so too with females. The average female has a larger life expectancy, and so will have a longer period to obtain benefits from Social Security. And so any change that preserves Social Security, that extends Social Security, the benefits from that change will fall disproportionately on white females, and worst of all the groups, on black males. So yeah, if you disaggregate, you see all that kind of thing. One thing you said that was fascinating, I didn't realize this, that in Seattle, you've got to pay basically a $75,000 fee if you want to build a second house. You said the result of that will be that only the rich can afford to build second houses. That is correct. There's another interesting result. If it's only the rich who can build the second houses, they're going to be building more expensive houses, which is going to increase the property values and drive up property taxes for everybody else. So that policy is going to lead to something I'm sure the people in Seattle would not like, and that's what is the word? Gentrification. It's going to lead to gentrification. It's an unintended consequence, but it's a perfectly predictable consequence.
Okay, thanks. Coming near the end of our time, but we're going to do a few more questions. Vicky in the chat asked a question that I was sort of thinking of when you talked about the media, the things that they show. And of course, our media landscape has been changing and is changing. Is that going to improve things as people start getting more information from alternative media sources? Is it going to make it worse? What do you think?
It depends. I think with alternate media sources, the mainstream media clearly has to compete more. Now, the question is, when we go to alternate media, what are we looking for? If we're looking for bad news, how is mainstream media going to compete? By showing us even worse news. If, on the other hand, we're going to alternate media to find, good news or more balanced news, mainstream media is going to have to compete by showing us that. So again, the media is not to blame here. It's very much us. The media is simply giving us what we have demonstrated we want.
Certainly when I think of alternative media, happy, sunshine, rainbows, good news is not what comes to mind. But maybe someone will give us an alternative media forum that will focus on that good news. It'll come to Roger with his hand up.
Hi there, Anthony. Thank you for the presentation, and thanks for holding these, Matt. I enjoy them. It's been a while, but I wanted to just quickly offer a comment, and hopefully I got a question in there, but maybe you can just comment on my comment. Is I see what you've done is very much reminds me a lot of Steven Pinker, like the data. I even look at it. I don't think there's even you need data, but I look. His question in his book Enlightenment Now summarizes everything, and like choose an area you would want to live in. Like you'd be kind of crazy not to say now. Even the fact that I could talk you through this mode speaks to that answer quite easily. But in terms of one thing I found interesting is for sure fear is a very strong human instinct, animal instinct. But you mentioned the word truth there. I'm interested in that tension between fear, truth, and again, we have overwhelming educated populace for, again, another plus that you don't need data to just prove that. And what that comes out of that attention of a mistrust and trust and who has the truth and how polarities grow. And I'm wondering, you mentioned in terms of, well, your book, cooperation, and I'm more interested in like, where do things go? Where you have this fear, and humans have a strong value. I don't want to call it an instinct, but they want to know truth. So it leads to this tension of, who do you trust? Individuals? Is it growing? Is it, and the polarities grow? And you mentioned administrators going, are lawyers taking off out through the roof as well? So I don't know if that's a question, but maybe you can comment that in general. And thank you again.
I think there's a learning curve here that we've got to go through. And the best I can do is give you an analogy. Well, I'm sure it applied to the rest of you as well, but when we were kids, and you go to the grocery store with your parents and you see the tabloids. The tabloids, I thought, they're telling me about aliens from space and somebody's head explodes and all this stuff. And I'm looking at my parents and saying, how are you keeping this from me? This is important stuff, right? And it's not until later in life that you realize, wait a minute, that thing, it looks like a newspaper, it reads like a newspaper, but clearly this is not the truth, right? You come to understand the nature of the thing you're looking at. And I think that there's been a shift in mainstream media, and you see it in social media as well, that we haven't caught up with yet. We haven't learned yet to look at mainstream media, social media, like we look at tabloids, or to be able to distinguish between the actual tabloids and the legitimate news. I think that will come in time. And as it comes in time, the media will settle down into determining whether it's going to be a source of entertainment and understood to be a source of entertainment, or whether it's going to be understood as a source of legitimate news. That's something that's going to play out over the next couple of decades, I would guess.
Right.
And by the way, you can see that now. Of course, I have students who are, they're 18 to 23 years old. They have a much, in my view, healthier view of the news than people my age do. They are much more skeptical about what they're looking at. Now, they may have gone too far in that they don't pay attention to it. So they're just blanking the whole thing out. It may take another generation before we get to people who understand how much of what they're reading they should pay attention to and how much they shouldn't. But my guess is this will happen.
Wonderful. That is a nice optimistic note for us to take end on. The kids are okay. Thank you to all of you for taking an hour of your time to join us here on Zoom. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. Antony, thanks so much for a great talk. I really enjoyed that. Reminder, one of you is going to receive a copy courtesy of the ILS of Cooperation and Coercion. But if that's not you, you may want to head to Amazon or your favorite local bookstore and pick up a copy of that. You can find Antony and James Harrigan on their podcast, Words and Numbers. I hope you will join us next week when we will be back with Rachel Ferguson. Some of you will recall she was going to be giving a talk for us earlier this month. She was ill and had to postpone that talk. That's been rescheduled for next Wednesday at noon. Rachel Ferguson will talk to us about Black liberation through the marketplace. I hope to see many of you with us then next week. And until then, everyone, please have a great week and a safe weekend. And we will see you soon. Take care, everyone.